pick the blue tie himself. He stood in front of the mirror in our hallway that Saturday morning, holding two ties against his chest. One navy, one burgundy, and he looked up at me and said, "Which one makes me look more like a real speaker, Mom?" And I told him the blue one, absolutely the blue one. And he nodded very seriously, like he'd already known that and just needed confirmation. That was 3 weeks before my brother's wedding. My son is 8. His name is Finn. He is the kind of kid who reads the instructions before opening a board game, who saves the last piece of Halloween candy for November because he likes having something to look forward to, who, when my brother called him last spring and asked him to give the welcome speech at the rehearsal dinner, said, and I heard this through the wall between rooms, "I'll need to start practicing right away." He was 7 at the time. He turned 8 in August. My brother's rehearsal dinner was the second weekend of September. For 4 months, Finn practiced that speech. He wrote it himself mostly. He asked me how to spell cherish and commitment. He asked my dad what makes a marriage last, and my dad told him honesty and patience and the ability to apologize when you're wrong, and Finn wrote all 3 down on a cue card in his careful printing. He practiced in front of the bathroom mirror. He practiced at the kitchen table while I made dinner. He practiced in the car on the way to his grandmother's house in Oakville, standing the cue card against the dashboard while I drove the 401 and tried not to cry at how earnest he was about the whole thing. My sister-in-law, my brother's fiancée, Margot, had been the one to suggest it actually. Back in April, at the engagement party my parents hosted at their place in Burlington, she'd pulled me aside in the kitchen and said she thought it would be so sweet for Finn to do something special at the rehearsal dinner that she'd always imagined having kids involved, that it would mean the world to her brother. I told her Finn would be honored. I meant it. He was honored. He took it seriously the way he takes everything seriously, in that quiet, methodical way of his that makes me feel like I'm raising someone far more composed than I will ever be. My brother is 4 years older than me. He and I have always been close, or I thought we were. He's the kind of older brother who showed up to my university convocation with a hand-painted sign and embarrassed me in front of everyone, and I loved him for it. He called me every Sunday for years, even after I moved to Hamilton, even after Finn's dad and I split up, and things got complicated and I stopped calling him as often as I should have. He always called. I thought that meant something. Margot I had known for 2 years by the time of the wedding. I liked her well enough. She was organized, efficient, particular about things, the seating chart, the centerpieces, the exact shade of white for the linens. I understood it. Weddings are stressful. I gave her the benefit of the doubt on most things. I gave her the benefit of the doubt right up until the night I stopped. The rehearsal dinner was at a private room in a restaurant in downtown Toronto near King and Spadina, one of those places with exposed brick and candlelight and a prefix menu. My parents drove up from Burlington. Finn wore his blue tie. He'd asked me that morning if we could stop at the Tim Hortons on Barton on the way to the GO station, and I said yes, and he got a hot chocolate and held it in both hands the whole train ride and talked about his speech. He wanted to know if he should pause after the first joke or go straight to the next part. I told him a pause was good. He nodded. He pulled out his cue card and read it to himself silently, moving his lips just barely. We arrived at the restaurant at 6:15. The private room was already half full. My parents were near the far end of the table. My mom in the pearl earrings she wears to every family occasion. My dad in his good blazer, the charcoal one he's had since my cousin's wedding 8 years ago. Finn spotted my dad immediately and ran to him. And my dad scooped him up even though Finn is almost too big for that now. And they hugged the way they always do, longer than you'd expect from a man who grew up in a generation that didn't hug often. Margot's family occupied the other end of the table. Her parents, her sister, a handful of cousins and aunts. Her sister, the one who'd been maid of honor, whose daughter was apparently the ring bearer, a little girl of about 5, named something that started with an E, I think, though I don't remember exactly, was sitting closest to Margot and my brother, whispering something, both of them leaning in together. I didn't think anything of it. I found my seat. Finn sat beside me. He took out his cue card and smoothed it on the table. My mom appeared at my elbow about 10 minutes later. She touched my arm and said quietly, "Can you come with me for a second?" I thought she needed help with something. I followed her out to the little hallway near the bathrooms away from the noise. She looked at me in that way she has, the way she's had my whole life, not quite meeting my eyes, looking slightly to the left of my face. She said, "There's been a change to the plan for tonight." I said, "What kind of change?" She said, "Margot's sister's little girl, Rosie. She's going to do the welcome. Instead of Finn." She paused. It was Margot's idea. She thought it would be more fitting to have someone from her side do it, since most of the other parts of the evening are from your dad's side. I stood there. I said, "Finn has been practicing for 4 months." My mom said, "I know." And the way she said it. Not quite an apology, not quite an acknowledgement, just a flat, "I know," that carried no weight, nothing attached to it. That was the moment something shifted in me. I said, "Who's going to tell him?" She said, "We thought you could." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I turned around and went back into the room. Finn looked up when I sat down. He said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "Yes, but just give me a second." I sat there for a moment. The candles on the table were the drippy kind that leave wax on the holder. Someone near Margot's end of the table laughed loudly. A big open laugh. My brother was smiling, leaning back in his chair, relaxed the way he gets when things are going the way he planned them. He hadn't said a word to me. He hadn't texted. He hadn't pulled me aside himself. He had sent our mother to tell me in a hallway, and he was sitting 15 feet away looking perfectly comfortable. I thought about the 4 months. I thought about Finn asking me how to spell cherish. I thought about the cue card smoothed out on the table in front of him right now, the corner slightly bent from being read so many times. I did not make a scene. I want to be clear about that. Part of it was Finn sitting right there. Part of it was that I've spent 31 years in a family that smooths things over and swallows things down and keeps the surface calm. And old habits are old habits. But I also just didn't know what to say. The words didn't come. I sat with it the way you sit with a thing that is too large to hold all at once. About 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my dad. 5 words, "Meet me outside. Right now." I told Finn I'd be back in 2 minutes and slipped out through the side door. My dad was standing on the sidewalk in his charcoal blazer, his hands in his pockets. It was early September and still warm in Toronto at night, that particular end of summer warmth that feels like borrowed time. He looked at me when I came out, and I could see he already knew, not just some of it, all of it. He said, "Your mother told me." I said, "When?" He said, 20 minutes ago. She seemed to think I already knew. He paused. I did not already know. My dad is not a man who raises his voice. He was an engineer for 35 years and he has the engineer's disposition, methodical, quiet, slow to react. He thinks before he speaks in a way that can sometimes feel like distance but is really just precision. He does not say things he doesn't mean. He does not perform. He looked at the street for a moment. Then he said, "Finn has been practicing since June." I said, "May, actually." He looked at me. He said, "Since May." Like he needed to hear it out loud again to believe it. I said, 4.5 months. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Has your brother spoken to you about this?" I said, "No." He said, "Has Margot?" I said, "No." He took a breath. He said, "Go back inside and sit with Finn. Don't say anything to him yet. I'll be in shortly." I didn't ask what he was going to do. I'd known my dad long enough to know that when he says, "I'll be in shortly" in that particular tone, something is about to happen and it is going to be quiet and it is going to be final. I went back inside. Finn was reading his cue card again. He looked up and said, "The server asked if I wanted sparkling water." And I said no. Because you always say I should say no to things I don't know. But was that right? And I said yes. That was exactly right. And I sat down beside him and put my hand over his hand on the table for a moment. My dad came back in about 5 minutes later. He walked the length of the room without hurrying and stood near the head of the table where my brother and Margot were sitting. He didn't sit down. He stood and waited, and people noticed the standing and the conversations dropped away one at a time. My brother said, "Dad, what are you?" My dad said, "I want to say something before dinner begins." Margot looked at my brother. My brother looked at Margot. Something passed between them that I saw from across the table. A flicker. Just a second. And then they both looked at my dad. My dad said, Finn has been preparing a welcome speech for this dinner since May. He has been looking forward to this night for 4.5 months. He paused. He is 8 years old. He wrote the speech himself. He asked me what makes a marriage last. Another pause. I want him to give that speech tonight. It was not a request. The way he said it made that clear. Margot started to say something. She said, we had actually decided. And my dad turned his head toward her, not unkindly, but very directly, and said, I think Finn should give the speech tonight. And I think whoever decided differently should have told him and his mother directly and not through an intermediary and not 30 minutes before dinner. The room was very quiet. Margot's sister looked at her plate. My brother said, Dad, and my dad said, I'm not angry. I'm saying what should have been said. Then he sat down, and that was it. That was the whole thing. I looked at Finn. He was looking at my dad with an expression I can't entirely describe. Not quite confusion, because I think some part of him understood what had just happened, even if he didn't have all the pieces, with something adjacent to wonder. He looked at me. He said, Am I still giving the speech? I said, Yes, bud, you're still giving the speech. He looked at his cue card. He straightened it on the table. He took a breath, the way he does before he starts something. Steady, deliberate. The breath of someone who was prepared. When the moment came, he stood up. He didn't shake. His voice was clear. He welcomed everyone to the dinner, mentioned that he was 8 and had been practicing since May, and hoped that counted for something, which got a genuine laugh from most of the room. He talked about what my dad told him. Honesty, patience, the ability to apologize when you're wrong. He looked at my brother at the word apologize, and I don't know if he meant anything by it or if it was just where his eyes went. But I saw my brother look down at the table. Finn thanked everyone for coming. He said he hoped the food was good and that everyone drove home safely because his mom always said that. The room applauded. A few people at Margot's end of the table clapped too, including, after a moment, Margot herself. My dad caught my eye across the table and gave me the smallest nod. We stayed for dinner. The food was good. Roasted salmon, spätzle, a salad with pickled beets that Finn refused to try. The conversation around us moved the way dinner conversations move, filling in the space, covering things over. My brother came to my end of the table at some point during dessert and crouched down next to my chair and said quietly, I should have called you. I'm sorry. I looked at him for a moment. I said, You should have called Finn. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. I don't know yet what that conversation will eventually become or if it will become anything. We have history, my brother and I, and history is complicated. What I know is that the apology was to me and should have been to an 8-year-old, and that's the thing I'm still sitting with. After dinner, when people were gathering coats and saying their goodbyes, my dad pulled me aside near the door. He pressed something into my hand. It was a small silver keychain, a maple leaf, simple. The kind you find at any gift shop in Canada, except I recognized it immediately because it had lived on my dad's key ring since before I was born. He'd gotten it from his own father. He told me once it was just a keychain, but he'd kept it because it was the last thing his father had given him before he died. The summer, my dad turned 26. He said, Give this to Finn. I said, Dad, this is yours. He said, It was my father's, now it's Finn's. He paused. He earned it tonight. I didn't argue. You don't argue with my dad when he says something in that tone. Not because he won't listen, but because he's already thought it through further than you have. On the train home, Finn held the keychain in his palm and turned it over in his fingers, looking at the maple leaf catching the light from the window. He was quiet for most of the ride, which is unusual for him. Just before we pulled into Hamilton Station, he said, Grandpa was proud of me, right? I said, Yeah, bud, he really was. He nodded. He closed his fingers around the keychain and held it. We drove home from the station in the dark. Finn fell asleep in the back seat before we hit the highway, his head dipped against the window, the keychain still in his hand. I drove with the radio off, the road quiet and straight, the lights of the city thinning out behind us. The cue card was in my bag. Finn had left it on the table after the speech, and I'd picked it up without thinking. I pulled it out at a red light and read it in the glow of the dashboard. The careful printing, the 3 things my dad had told him. The spelling of cherish we had looked up together on a Tuesday evening in June while pasta boiled on the stove. He keeps the keychain on his nightstand now. The cue card is in a frame. Neither of those things was my idea. They were both his. I keep thinking about the cue card. The corners bent from being handled so many times, the careful printing, the word cherish spelled correctly because we looked it up together on a Tuesday in June. Finn didn't know, when he wrote that speech, that he was also writing something about integrity, about what it looks like to show up prepared, to take something seriously when everyone around you has already decided it doesn't matter. What happened that night in Toronto wasn't complicated, when I think about it clearly. My brother and Margot made a choice. They made it without telling us, without explaining it, without offering Finn the basic dignity of a conversation. They sent my mother into a hallway to deliver the news and then sat 15 feet away, looking perfectly relaxed. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a decision about whose feelings are worth protecting and whose aren't, and they'd already made it before we walked through the door. What my dad did was the opposite of that. He stood up. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way that was designed to humiliate anyone. He just said what was true, in front of the people who needed to hear it, in a room where everyone had quietly agreed not to say it. That takes something. I'd been trying to name what it takes exactly, and I think it's this. It takes a person who has decided, at some point in their life, that doing the right thing matters more than keeping the surface smooth. My dad has been that person quietly, consistently, for as long as I can remember. He didn't start that night. He just showed me something I hadn't seen up close before. Finn showed me something too. When he stood up at that table with his cue card and his blue tie, he wasn't performing. He was just doing what he prepared to do. He'd been told he wasn't giving the speech, and then he was told he was, and he processed that in about 12 seconds, and then he stood up. That's not something I taught him. That's something he came to on his own. The understanding that you do the work regardless, that the preparation isn't wasted even when circumstances shift, that you don't let other people's chaos become your excuse. He's 8. He figured that out faster than most adults do. I've been thinking about what we pass on to our kids without meaning to. Not the things we sit them down and explain. The lessons we actually deliver are the ones we live in front of them, in hallways and parking lots and quiet moments in the car. My dad spent 35 years being the kind of man who does what he says and says what he means and doesn't make a production of either. Finn watched him stand up at that table. He will remember it in the way kids remember things that matter. Not the details necessarily, but the feeling of it, the shape of it, the knowledge that someone will stand up. The keychain is on his nightstand. The cue card is in a frame. My brother apologized to me. He hasn't apologized to Finn, not yet. And that's something I'm still figuring out how to hold. What I know is this. The right thing done quietly, in front of the right people, at the right moment, echoes further than you think. My dad knew that. Now Finn does too.